What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will explore the important lives and legacy of the female muse and appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more, important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Hi listeners, host Grace Anna here. Today I am sharing part 2 of a special 2-part episode from our friends at The Art of Crime, a podcast that explores the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. In part 2, host Gavin Whitehead tells us about Josephine Baker's time fighting with the French resistance in World War II, a daring mission she took when she delivered top-secret documents to the British intelligence service, and finally, how she earned the highest French Medal of Honor at the end of the war. Josephine Baker's story is so unbelievable that you'll be gasping as you listen along. I want to give The Art of Crime a special shout-out. It's rare to find a like-minded podcast that is so well-written and researched. If you have enjoyed The Art of Crime's 2-part episode on Josephine Baker, I highly encourage you to check out their other episodes. Currently, The Art of Crime is in its 6th season. Titled Spy vs. Spy, this season explores artists from all throughout history who have worked as spies. ArtMuse will be returning in the new year with a 2-part episode on the famed actress and eccentric Sarah Bernhardt. With that, I hope you enjoy part 2 of The Art of Crime's episode on Josephine Baker.
It was late 1939 or early 1940 when the telephone rang at the Deuxième Bureau, a French intelligence agency. Somebody handed the receiver to Agent Jacques Abte. Singer, dancer, and movie star Josephine Baker was on the other end. 6 days earlier, Abte had recruited her as an honorable correspondent or volunteer spy. "Come quickly," Baker urged him. "I would be so happy to see you." As Baker well knew, she could not disclose sensitive information over the phone. Anybody could be listening, including German intelligence men. Sensing the urgency in her voice, Abte promised to meet her just as soon as he could. Agent Abte and H.C. Baker rendezvoused in central Paris, the entertainer rolling up in her supremely sleek black and white delage, its seats upholstered with scintillating snakeskin, a ride that was suitably stylish for a spy. Baker invited Abte to get in so they could talk while she drove. Her handler obliged. As she tore through the streets of Paris, Baker emitted a, quote, furious torrent, unquote, of words, as if more agitated than excited by what she had to say. Baker was on friendly terms with an attaché at the Italian embassy, and she had pumped him for all the information he had on Italy's war plans. Benito Mussolini had yet to join the conflict that was slowly engulfing Europe, and politicians around the world were at pains to divine if and when the dictator would. Baker had gotten this guy talking and found that if she kept pushing back on the stock platitudes and evasions he gave her, he would lean in and whisper what Italy was really up to. By dint of this strategy, Baker was able to learn that Il Duce, Italian for the leader as Mussolini was known, was on the verge of entering the war on the side of Nazi Germany. Baker had extracted some valuable intelligence from her attaché friend, but she did not have Abte's undivided attention as she talked him through it. She was swerving, braking, and punching the pedal to the metal as if she were in a high-speed chase, making him worry for both his and her safety. Baker had driven like a madwoman before. On one occasion, she rammed her vehicle straight into a streetlight near the Paris Grand Hotel. A crowd gathered, clearly concerned for the driver's well-being, but Baker soon allayed their fears. She hopped out of the car, signed a few autographs, and caught a cab home, as cool as could be. That misadventure ended happily enough, for everyone but the lamppost, that is, and thankfully Baker did not crash the car when Apte was with her. Nevertheless, the intelligence man came away from the conversation with doubts about his latest recruit. He wrote later that he saw her erratic driving and stream of consciousness debriefing as signs of, quote, unbelievable nervousness, unquote. The Deuxième Bureau had brought her on board partly because it lacked qualified personnel and financial resources, and he wondered if she would ever receive, quote, the very special training, unquote, that would set her up for success. In less than a year, Baker would prove her handler dead wrong. Josephine Baker embarked on her most dramatic secret mission after the Nazi occupation of Paris in June 1940. Abandoning her Parisian home, she took refuge in a medieval castle in southern France, where she joined the French resistance. The work she did there, and elsewhere, would earn her the highest French Medal of Honor after war's end. Today, we'll hear how Paris fell to the Nazis, how Baker and Apte reunited after that calamity, and how the two of them planned and executed a daring mission to deliver top-secret documents to the British Secret Intelligence Services. This is The Art of Crime, and I'm your host, Gavin Whitehead. Welcome to another episode of Spy vs. Spy, From Lisbon with Love, Josephine Baker, Part 2. Nobody could believe how quickly it all happened. On May 10, 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered the invasion of France. After stampeding into the neutral countries of the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, German troops prepared to enter France by way of the northeastern Ardennes region. The Allied powers had long viewed this stretch of land as a natural barrier to foreign invasion, because its dense forests, rolling hills, and rough terrain would not be easy for armored vehicles to navigate. This assessment proved gravely mistaken. Thanks to the relentless brutality of the German blitzkrieg, Hitler's forces surged through the Ardennes and into France, overwhelming Allied soldiers who met them in battle. By the beginning of June, the unthinkable became the inevitable, as Germans gunned and bombed their way toward Paris. As the enemy closed in, many French men and women fled, yet Josephine Baker remained undaunted. Around the beginning of the Nazi incursion into France, Baker was singing and dancing in a star-studded musical revue titled Paris, London. The show was running for the entertainment of Allied soldiers who were stationed at fortifications along the French border with Germany. Even as Nazi panzers advanced on Paris, Allied soldiers needed to maintain a presence on the border south of the Ardennes. As the fighting raged, hospitals near to where Paris, London was running filled with wounded servicemen. When Baker wasn't on stage, she visited the wards and did whatever she could to boost morale, making beds, bathing patients, and never refusing a request for a song. Then, on June 10th, Baker's manager, Henri Varna, canceled Paris, London. This was the star's cue to pack her bags and hightail it to safe harbor outside the French capital. She set about loading her car with clothing as well as other necessities. Her cargo included champagne bottles full of gasoline, a commodity that would become increasingly precious in the coming months. Seated behind the wheel, Baker motored toward the Dordogne region of southern France, where earlier that year she had rented a property that would serve as her safe haven. The mass exodus out of Paris and other cities made the trip interminable. The roads were jammed with vehicles of every make and model: horse-drawn carts, farm wagons, bicycles, and even hearses. After hours of frustrating stop-and-go traffic, Baker reached the farmlands of Périgueux, where the Dordogne River wound through open meadows and woodland alike. Here, an ancient castle hugged a sheer cliff. There, a palace overlooked a ravine. Finally, Baker turned onto a dirt lane and crossed a stone bridge into a small village. Zipping through town, she drove up a hill and came to a stop in front of a large gateway studded with iron. She had arrived at the place that she would call home for the foreseeable future, the Château de Méland. Built in the late 15th century, the chateau had an imposing, even fearsome exterior. Gargoyles, demons, and dragons glared down on all who entered. The castle would offer Baker a much-needed sense of security as the Nazi war machine went about its bloody business. In the words of Damian Lewis, author of Agent Josephine, quote, "The ancient building, with its secret nooks and crannies, its deep cellars, twisting stone staircases, and soaring towers, seemed to offer the perfect hideaway," unquote. It also afforded ample space for her private menagerie. Ever the animal lover, Baker moved into the medieval dwelling with a small zoo's worth of fauna, including a Great Dane named Benzo, a monkey named Glue Glue or Gobble Gobble in English, a golden lion tamarin by the name of Mika, and 2 mice whose names translated to Curly and Question Mark. It was, in other words, a full house. By June 14, 1940, the Nazis considered their mission accomplished. That day, jackboots marched down the boulevards of Paris, and before long, a Nazi flag was flying from the pinnacle of the Eiffel Tower. The speed and ferocity of the invasion astonished the world, and there's little wonder why. Quote, "By taking Paris, the Germans had succeeded in doing in 38 days what they had failed to achieve in the entire First World War, which had lasted 4 years and cost 2 million lives," unquote. Hitler himself took a trip to the City of Lights a week or 2 after it fell to the Nazis to savor his latest conquest. Soon, the Nazis hammered out an armistice with French officials, whereby France was divided in 2. The invaders controlled the north, more than half of the country. Meanwhile, the French Prime Minister, Marshal Philippe Pétain, a decorated veteran of the First World War, would lead the south, referred to as the Free Zone. Petain's government was headquartered in the southern spa town of Vichy. Despite the terms of this treaty, many French men and women were not prepared to capitulate to Nazi Germany. Across the country, small cells formed with the aim of undermining the Nazis through armed conflict, sabotage, espionage, and other means. Collectively, these groups were known as the French Resistance, and Josephine Baker was about to join the cause. In the days and weeks following the fall of Paris, Baker could do little more than hunker down at Château des Milandes. She swore never to sing or dance in Paris until it was purged of the Nazis, certainly not while theaters were marred by signs with advisories like, quote, "access forbidden to dogs or Jews," unquote. But plenty of performers and impresarios went ahead and plied their trades, even if it meant catering to foreign adversaries. Cinemas, cafes, and nightclubs reopened and did a brisk business. Baker was of a more defiant disposition and wanted to fight back, but how? Her prospects of spying were dim for the moment. She had lost contact with the Deuxième Bureau. For all she knew, her handler, Jacques Abte, was already dead, pumped full of lead by SS thugs. Left to her own devices, she transformed the Château des Milandes into a bastion of resistance. Soon, it housed a small cell of like-minded men and women. There was a guy named Joseph Bouet, a French Air Force pilot. Another chateau habitué was the village blacksmith Georges Malochy, who lived across the way from des Milandes. Baker befriended him and took his 2 small children for joyrides around town. Maybe not the safest pastime given the singer's speed demon tendencies. As the Nazi occupation dragged on, Malochy came to despise the Germans and teamed up with Baker and the rest of the Milandes crew. The blacksmith operated a covert radio transmitter in one of the castle's towers, a device capable of sending dispatches all the way to Britain. Meanwhile, Baker and her team took steps to prepare for mortal combat with the occupiers. Bit by bit, they stockpiled weapons in the chateau's cellar, ready to be distributed to nearby members of the resistance if necessary. Baker was unaware of it while she was adjusting to her life at the Château des Milandes, but the Deuxième Bureau was also lending its services to the resistance. Back when the Germans were bearing down on the French capital, Paul Pelot, a top member of the Bureau, ordered the destruction of all non-essential documents in an effort to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Then, he and his men packed what was left and evacuated the agency's Paris headquarters. At this point, agents of the French intelligence service scattered in all directions, leaving the Deuxième Bureau fragmented. After a helter-skelter retreat, Pelot landed in the southern port city of Marseille, where he oversaw espionage in support of the resistance. This was not so simple as opening new facilities for the Deuxième Bureau. The Germans would rain down on him like a volley of mortars. Instead, he would need a multi-layered cover that would conceal his activities. To that end, Paylol established a bogus agricultural organization called the Rural Works Agency. The French acronym is TR, and that's the one I'll use. Gradually, word spread among intelligence circles as well as resistance groups that the TR was up and running. One of the agents who reunited with Paylol at the TR was Jacques Abte. Like Paylol, Abte was committed to combating the Nazis in whatever way he could, but it was not immediately clear how he should go about it. Eventually, Abte and Paylol caught wind of a modest cell of resistance fighters based out of a medieval chateau in the Dordogne region, helmed by none other than Josephine Baker. Abte had changed his mind about Baker's potential as a spy since that nerve-wracking drive through central Paris. She had grown more disciplined, more cunning before the Nazi invasion. She had even obtained valuable insight into Japan's intentions to enter the war. Discussing the matter with Paylol, Abte concluded that he could do the most good for the TR by joining the crew at the Chateau de Milande. This would allow him not only to collaborate with Baker, but also with other supporters of the resistance in the vicinity. With Paylol's blessing, he jumped in his car and headed for the Dordogne. Baker was overjoyed when Abte materialized out of nowhere at the chateau. "Fox of misfortune, where the hell did you come from?" she called out to him. As I mentioned in the previous episode, Abte was introduced to Baker under the alias of Mr. Fox, hence the Fox of Misfortune bit. "I thought you were dead," she went on, "buried with a kilo of buckshot in your back. Come on, a quick trip to the barber's, a brush of your boots, and you'll be fresh and ready." As it happened, Abte had already made a big change that Baker needed to know about. Mr. Fox was no more. He ceased to be as soon as Pétain cut his collaborationist deal with the Nazis. From now on, Abte would answer to the name of Jack Sanders. Jack, he explained, was a citizen of the United States, a conveniently neutral country at this point. He even had a passport to go with his new identity. "Hello, Mr. Jack Sanders," Baker laughed. They cracked jokes about sneaking off to London to hang out with a mutual hero of theirs, General Charles de Gaulle, and Baker showed him around the chateau, introducing him to her house guests as well as her assorted four-legged friends. She also would have taken him downstairs to the subterranean arsenal that she and her compatriots were slowly amassing. The chateau made a congenial home base. Then again, Baker and her brothers and sisters in arms were never entirely safe. As Abte would have warned her, the Germans were dispatching soldiers, Gestapo goons, and SS brutes by the truckload to the Free Zone, the southern part of France where the chateau was located, partly for the purpose of ferreting out resistance fighters. It would have seemed probable, maybe even inevitable, that one day the enemy would arrive on their doorstep. We'll hear more after a quick break. It was about lunchtime one afternoon, and Baker was in the dining room conversing with two visitors to the chateau. Both were former agents of the Deuxième Bureau, now in service to the TR. Jacques Abte was out fishing on the Dordogne River, a favorite hobby of his, leaving Baker on her own with the spies. She and the intelligence men were putting their heads together about how best to establish a chain of communication with the British Secret Intelligence Service. The TR agents had also come with details about German plans for a hostile takeover of the Free Zone. In preparation for just such an invasion, they had brought with them a cache of deadly munitions to be added to Baker's subterranean armory. She and her guests were as good as dead if caught in possession of this intelligence and these weapons. So it was when a burst of sharp raps came at the heavy oaken door to the chateau. Baker would later speak of them as terrible blasts that threatened to unhinge the door. A moment or two passed, and Baker's housemaid, the dependable libellule, dragonfly in French, rushed into the dining room, ashen-faced. "There are 6 of them," she intoned, "an officer, a non-commissioned officer, and 4 soldiers." There was not a moment to lose. Taking charge of the situation, Baker directed her visitors, plus a handful of other resistance members present in the chateau, to make themselves scarce and shut themselves up in the furthest recesses of the property. With her orders issued, Baker turned to the housemaid and instructed her to show the uninvited guests into the library, where she would be waiting. The library was the singer's favorite room in the castle, its handsome bookshelves and perennial quiet never failing to calm her. A minute or two later, Baker heard the echoes of boots ascending the stone staircase that led to this level and nearing the library. Finally, Lalibelul entered with a German officer in tow, his uniform emblazoned with a swastika clasped in the talons of an eagle. Baker later described the colonel as cold and stiff as a corpse. Nevertheless, the young man exuded a terrible power. Spying Josephine, he came to a stop, clicked his heels, and gave a Nazi salute. "Heil Hitler," he declared. The lady of the house did not follow suit. After a brief silence, the colonel explained his reason for calling in immaculate French. Think Christoph Waltz in Inglourious Bastards. "Madam, I am a member of the Armistice Commission, and I have special responsibility for controlling arms depots in the unoccupied zone." He reached into a pocket and pulled out a search warrant. Arms depots? Could he possibly know about the stockpile in the basement? Had somebody tipped him off? "The officer cannot be speaking seriously if he thinks I am hiding weapons here," she replied in a steady tone. She hazarded a joke. "It is true that I have Native American Indian grandparents, but they left the warpath a long time ago." She didn't get a laugh. The colonel pocketed the warrant but remained in place. It would take more than a casual wisecrack to get rid of this guy. "You were taking coffee?" he asked. "Not yet." "My apologies, but do you have any coffee?" This was a power play, nothing more, an attempt to coerce hospitality out of his unwilling hostess. "We have a little," Baker conceded. She had no choice but to play his game for now. "And some sugar to put in it?" Very little sugar. Baker had seen an opportunity to needle the officer and took it. It was precisely because of the German invasion and the chaos it had bred that commodities like sugar were scarce and expensive. "Ugh, the war is terrible," he sighed. "If it were only a matter of sugar and coffee," Baker needled again. "You must miss the theater a lot, madam." He was changing the subject now. What was he angling at? "I would not have the heart to go on stage when there is so much suffering," Baker retorted in her most direct acknowledgement of the pain the Nazis were inflicting on France. "We did not want this war. So let the German army leave France," Baker broke in. The officer laughed. Was it a show of contempt? Did he think her naive? Or was he perhaps the slightest bit nervous, taken aback by her naked defiance? "I see you favor simple solutions," he smirked. "I think they are always the best," she countered. The officer pursed his lips, changing tack once again. "Are you telling me you have no weapons here?" "To tell the truth, madam, we received a denunciation." So somebody had talked. What she said next could mean life or death for her and her friends. Thinking quickly, Baker parried his question with another. "What is worse, to denounce or to believe those who denounce?" "This is war, madam." "Then long live peace." The colonel gave another laugh and fell silent, contemplating his next move. Clearing his throat, he went on, "I will not trouble you any longer. But be careful." With that, he gave a salute by way of farewell, turned on his heels, and exited the library. Baker emerged from the interrogation unscathed, but was very much unnerved. The colonel may have left the premises, but there was not a doubt in her mind that he would place the castle under surveillance. Scarcely 24 hours passed when another unfamiliar man arrived at Baker's gates. Lalibelul went out to greet him, sizing him up as they talked. He was younger than the Nazi colonel, in his late teens or early 20s by the look of it. He had a thick raincoat draped over one shoulder and a leather briefcase in his right hand. The newcomer demanded to speak with Madame Baker. Cagey, though not at all impolite, Lalibelul asked him to identify himself and declare his business. In a gesture that did little to reassure the housemaid, he declined to do so. "My name will not mean anything to her because she does not know me, and I do not know her personally. But please, tell her I have come on a matter of the utmost importance." Libelul agreed to notify her mistress of his arrival, though not without adding that Baker may not wish to admit him. A tremor must have passed up Baker's spine when Libelul informed her of the unannounced visitor. Abte was out of the house yet again, this time for business rather than pleasure, which meant that Baker would have to navigate this potential minefield on her own. And given the timing of this surprise, Baker was all but convinced that the Nazis were to blame. She told Libelul to find out what he wanted. The maidservant went back outside and found the young man where she had left him. "Madame asks that you let her know the reason for your visit. Madame is very busy." The stranger leaned forward with an earnest look in his eyes. "Please, tell your mistress that I must speak to her at all costs." "Come now, sir," Lalibulul began, losing her patience with his evasiveness. But before she could say more, he broke in. "I won't leave this place without seeing her. If you tell me to leave, I'll just find a way in through the window." Seeing little alternative, Libelul showed him in and brought him to the kitchen where Baker received him. As soon as the young man was alone with the Chatelaine, he let loose a torrent of words. "Forgive me, madam, for my approach, which must appear so impertinent to you, but you certainly will understand right away my behavior. I have some documents of great value for you to remit to the intelligence services." He opened his suitcase and produced a sheaf of papers. "This is only a first delivery. I will make another in a fortnight, and after that I will ask you to put me on the road to England." The documents had certainly aroused Baker's interest, but she barely even glanced at them. She had played dumb yesterday, and she would do the same today. "Good sir, I'm afraid you're mistaken. I have no idea what you are talking about." "But the intelligence services," he protested. "I haven't the slightest idea what you are talking about," the singer doubled down. "I don't know what this intelligence service is, and as for getting you to England, why, I would be at a loss. I am an artist, and I have only ever concerned myself with my art." At that moment, Apte strode into the kitchen, just back from errands he had run for the TR. Relieved to have an ally by her side, Baker turned to him. "Jack, would you check what this man wants? I don't understand a word he's talking about." Then, addressing the young man again, she assured him, "You may speak with him as openly as you would with me." The visitor reiterated his reasons for coming to the Chateau de Milan, and Apte, like Baker, insisted that he had no involvement with the intelligence services. "This can't be true," he objected. "I know that I can't be mistaken because the person who sent me here cannot have misled me." "Who sent you?" Apte butted in. "The Reverend Father Victor Delar. You must know him. He is in Vichy. For 3 weeks, myself and a comrade searched for a way to join General de Gaulle. But we didn't want to leave empty-handed. Chance served us well, and we were able to get a hold of the secret code of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Now I'm handing it to you so you can get it to London." The young man paused, searching the eyes of Baker and Apte for signs of recognition, excitement, camaraderie, anything that would indicate he had not undertaken his journey in vain. As Baker and Apte stayed silent, he went on, "It was Father Delar who told me. Ask for the Chateau de Milan. There you'll find the artiste Josephine Baker. Give her your documents and stay at the chateau until you leave for London." Apte knew the name of Father Delar, to be sure. At the same time, he was pretty sure the Germans did too. The more the youth talked, the more it seemed like he was setting them up. "I don't know this religious man whom you're talking about," he responded. "But I am sure he told me the truth," he protested. "Besides, sir, you have an English accent." "Sir, please calm down," Apte cut him off. "I'm sorry for your long journey, believe me. And perhaps I am sympathetic to your cause, but I'm not English. I'm American and a complete stranger to your war. Besides, I am an artist like Miss Baker. Quite frankly, you have made a mistake. Keep your documents." "But I don't know who you are, and I don't want to know," Apte talked over him. "Have a strong cup of coffee, some bacon and eggs, and head home. There's a train at 6 p.m., the only one before tomorrow. Godspeed. You'd best be on it." Seemingly deflated, the visitor gave it up and took a solitary meal in the kitchen before repacking his briefcase and leaving for the train station. With the mystery guest gone, both Baker and Apte could breathe easily again. Yet no sooner had they relaxed than they found themselves caught in a Mobius loop of self-doubt. Had they just dodged a trap, or had they turned away an ally? Surely it was no coincidence that this stranger had popped up out of the blue just one day after that grinning, gun-toting Nazi from the Armistice Commission had paid them a visit. But then, what if it was? He had seemed passionate about aiding the resistance. But maybe these emotions were insincere, just part of a ruse. After all, if the Nazis meant to ensnare the mistress of Chateau de Milan, they would have sent their most adept double-crosser for the job. And wasn't his age suspicious? Would any senior member of the resistance trust a man barely old enough to grow a beard with intelligence that could potentially fend off Hitler's blitzkrieg? It was plain implausible. But in some ways, they reasoned, twisting yet again in their logical contortions, the implausibility of it all was the most powerful evidence of its genuineness. If the Armistice Commission were trying to trick them, why would they have deployed such an improbable tactic? The more they mulled it over, the more they feared they had made a mistake. Their only option was to stop the young man before he caught his train. If they still had doubts after questioning him further, they could hand him over to the police as an agent provocateur. And if he was who he said he was, they could bring him into the fold. But first, they needed to make hell for leather for the train station. As the most seasoned intelligence officer among them, Abte took the lead, racing to a nearby police station and filling in the chief, a secret ally of the resistance. The two of them hopped in a car and sped to the train station. When they pulled up near the platform and surveyed the scene, however, the young man was nowhere to be found. Abte cursed himself. He and Baker had tarried too long. But he and the policeman still had a shot at intercepting the young man before it was too late. He would almost certainly change trains in the town of Sirac, and if they hurried, they could just possibly catch him. Within the hour, Abte and the police chief leapt out of the car at the Sirac train station, pushing their way through a crowd of travelers as they double-timed it to the platform. Looking every direction, Abte finally spotted the young man in a railside bistro, passing the time until his next train came. The youth made eye contact with Abte at the exact same moment, turning pale as he realized that Abte was in the company of a police officer. He whirled around and broke into a sprint. Abte gave chase, jostling past bystanders and yelling, "Police! You need to come with us! Police!" Running as fast as they could, they finally caught up with the fugitive, who turned to face them without the slightest indication of fear in his eyes. Catching their breath, they led him to the police car and relieved him of the suitcase and overcoat he had brought to the chateau. When he was ordered to hand over his documents, however, the prisoner spat back, "Impossible. I do not have them anymore." "Where are they?" the police chief barked. "Torn up and thrown away." "Where?" "Near the chateau." "Driver, to the chateau," the policeman bellowed. They motored back the way they came, the young man smoking in a corner seat. Silence pervaded until Abte spoke up. "What is your name?" "Le Besneret," he muttered, ignoring Abte's gaze. Abte blinked. He recognized that name. "Are you related to the head of the SNCF?" he asked, referring to France's state-owned railway company. It was headed by Robert-Henri Le Besneret, a mover and shaker in the French resistance. "He is my uncle," came the terse reply. Abte studied him. "You know that you are risking a lot if you don't tell me the truth." The young man stuck to his story, and finally, Abte dispensed with the performance. He had lied to him at Milan, he confessed, and if he had been charged with intelligence as important as he claimed, the two of them could most assuredly work together. "I believe you," the young man exclaimed, suddenly reanimated. "But I didn't tear up the documents or hide them near your castle. When I spied you at the station, I had an idea to get rid of them, so I hid them under the table at the bistro. You will find them there, but hurry because they are very important." The driver did a U-turn and whizzed back to Sirac. Once arrived at the station, they conducted a sweep of the cafe and recovered the documents, seemingly untouched since the youth had abandoned them. Abte and the police chief were as much relieved by the retrieval as impressed by the young man's courage. Reviewing Le Besneret's files, Abte and company determined that while the young man had furnished valuable information, he had also mischaracterized it. The dossier held encrypted Luftwaffe messages, not the key to the Luftwaffe code as Le Besneret had told them. This was probably an honest mistake. After a quick inspection, Abte was able to decipher some of the contents. They included locations of key Luftwaffe airbases along with lists of the aircraft at each one. The British would be grateful for this intelligence, but only if Abte could place it in their hands. We'll hear how he and Baker accomplished this dangerous feat after a quick break. Since the fall of Paris, spy master Paul Pelot and his network of agents, including Jacques Abte and Josephine Baker, had acquired intelligence that could prove nothing short of vital to the British in their fight against the Germans. However, Pelot had no viable way of conveying this information to his allies. When the Nazis swarmed Paris, intelligence officers ran for the hills and communications went silent between Pelot's operatives and some of their closest allies, the British Secret Intelligence Service. Pelot needed to establish an information pipeline with the SIS, ideally one that would allow two-way communication. Pelol decided that the safest place to make contact with British intelligence officers was the Portuguese capital of Lisbon. It was known in the spy world that the British embassy in Lisbon was home to a small team of SIS men. They had a direct line to their colleagues in London. Speed was of the essence. Up until now, Portugal had stayed out of the escalating war in Europe, making it easier for Allied spies to operate there. But Portugal could enter the fray at any moment, and it wasn't at all clear which side it would support. On the one hand, the Portuguese head of state, Antonio Oliveira Salazar, had renewed a commitment to the long-standing alliance between his country and Britain. On the other, Salazar was a dictator with a fascist bent, aligning him with his Spanish counterpart Francisco Franco, a friend of the Nazis. There was also the distinct possibility that Portugal might get dragged into the conflict against its own volition. This was because Portugal boasted bountiful supplies of tungsten. You probably know this tough, heavy, heat-resistant mineral as the material that light bulb filaments are made of. In times of war, though, you could also use tungsten to harden body armor or sharpen armor-piercing bullets. The Germans lusted after Portugal's abundance of tungsten, and it was feared they might invade the Iberian nation to claim it for their own. Planning the mission to Lisbon, Pelol selected Jacques Abte as the lead operative on account of his contacts in the British Secret Intelligence Service. Pelol called upon Abte to deliver a veritable trove of intelligence to the British embassy in Lisbon. This included not just what Abte and Baker had received from Les Besnarets, but additional documents that the TR had gathered. The dossier included a list of all known Abwehr agents, that is, German spies, operating in Britain, as well as the coordinates of key Luftwaffe air bases in France. Then there were breakdowns of several German strategies to expand their stranglehold on Western Europe. One operation involved Gibraltar, a British-controlled island fortress located between southern Iberia and North Africa. British ships, as well as vessels from other nations, passed nearby while traveling through the Straits of Gibraltar, the waterway connecting the Atlantic Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea. The United Kingdom relied on this maritime corridor for trade. By mid-1940, German vessels had begun to gather off the coast of France, awaiting orders to invade Gibraltar. If the Nazis seized the territory, the Axis powers would hold sway over the Mediterranean from Italy in the east to Gibraltar in the west. And if the Germans installed heavy guns on Gibraltar, they could make the straits too perilous for use by British vessels, with disastrous implications for international trade. It was Josephine Baker who devised a subterfuge that would enable her and Abte to convey this intelligence to Lisbon. Even in wartime, perhaps especially amid such an upheaval, Europeans hungered for entertainment, and performers like Baker were eager to satisfy that appetite. As the singer well knew, she had thousands of fans in Portugal, but had never performed there. If she announced her first ever Portuguese tour, that would provide a convenient pretext for her to enter the country, the German war plans and other top-secret documents stashed in her luggage. This at first seemed like a promising path, but they quickly hit a roadblock. Baker would require a temporary visa to visit Lisbon, and the Portuguese government was inundated with visa applications from refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied Europe. Crafty as a veteran counterintelligence officer, Baker conceived a workaround. Abandoning the idea of engagements in Portugal, she instead proposed a tour of Brazil. To reach that country, she would have to catch a liner leaving Lisbon, the main point of departure for South American destinations. If they adopted this plan, she would still have a plausible reason for stopping in Lisbon. Because they would only be passing through Portugal rather than quote-unquote touring there, they could apply for a travel visa through the Brazilian government, a far quicker process. Baker just so happened to have high-level contacts at the Brazilian embassy, as well as the kind of star power that inspired the most sluggish of bureaucrats to work at warp speed. "I know the Brazilian ambassador very well," she informed Abte. "I'll tell him I'm planning a tour of his country. He'll be delighted. Once we have the Brazilian visas, the rest will take care of itself." Baker, it turned out, was right. She had her transit permits in no time. Baker's supposed Brazilian sojourn in turn provided a cover for Abte. When an entertainer of her stature went on the road, she invariably traveled with a whole lot of luggage, plus a team of assistants who could take care of pragmatics. Booking hotels, coordinating transport to and from concert venues, handling the money, and so on and so forth. Abte would pose as Baker's tour manager. To that end, He assumed a new identity, the third he had adopted since meeting Agent Baker. Paylol secured him yet another passport, this one bearing the name of M. Jacques Francois Hébert, supposedly an erstwhile ballet master from Marseille. Abte would have to age himself 8 years to play the role. His fake passport gave his date of birth as September 16, 1899. This was no caprice on Paylol's part. The Vichy regime had implemented new restrictions preventing men young enough to serve in the military from crossing the border. The government introduced these measures to prevent opponents of the Nazis from enlisting in Allied forces abroad. Crafting a disguise for Monsieur Hébert, Abte procured a pair of thick-rimmed spectacles and grew a prodigious mustache, the kind you might see the average cretin wearing on the street, Abte wrote later. To round out the illusion, the words accompanying Miss Baker were stamped on his passport. With the plan taking shape, Abte transcribed the most sensitive intelligence with invisible ink. Both the Allies and the Axis were exploring how best to produce and use this covert means of communication, and some of their ideas were pretty creative. For example, the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had pursued the possibility of inking secret messages on women's undergarments. The thinking was, what self-respecting soldier or official would stoop so low as to search a woman's underwear for secret messages? They say truth is the first casualty of war, but the Nazis seem to think chivalry would stick around. The British had reached even farther in their search for the ideal invisible ink, and were especially intrigued by one that came from a, quote, natural source of supply, unquote. On second thought, they hadn't reached much farther than their belt buckles, since what they were talking about was human testicles. Yep, at one time, British intelligence agents thought of semen as a promising form of invisible ink, because it defied conventional means of detection. In the end, this source of supply proved sadly limited. According to one report, efforts to fill reserves of this all-natural ink made life quote-unquote intolerable for those involved because it resulted in, quote, excessive masturbation, unquote. And now for the pièce de résistance, the stroke of genius that makes this story as perfect as could be for this particular podcast. It's unclear what kind of invisible ink Abte used for the Lisbon job, but we know that he used it to copy top-secret intelligence on musical scores for maybe Baker's most famous anthem, J'ai du amour. The title translates to I Have Two Loves, and Baker's two loves are the United States and Paris, the first being the country of her birth and the second the city of her rebirth as a star. As she sings in the chorus, quote, I have two loves, my country and Paris. Always through them, my heart is thrilled, unquote. She first crooned these lyrics at the Casino de Paris in the wake of her disastrous Austrian tour. The audience went wild, and she would perform the barn burner countless times throughout the rest of her career. With these preparations made, Baker was well on her way to Lisbon. It was the middle of the night when Abte awoke, alone in his bed at Château de Méland, to the sound of a crash. It had come from outside, possibly the garden. Adrenaline coursed through him as he peered out his window and surveyed the grounds below. He could see no movement, no footprints, no signs of an intruder, nothing. But then his eye fell on the shuttered window of a chamber at the center of the chateau, a private room where Baker kept a safe. He could barely make it out from where he lay, but a faint light was flickering inside the safe room. Had the noise come from there? Who would be up and about at this hour? Was somebody trying to break into the safe? Determined to find out, Abte climbed out of bed as quickly as he could and stole out of his room in nothing but his night clothes. He tiptoed to the sleeping quarters of Emmanuel Bayonne, a fellow fighter in the Shadow War against the Nazis. Inside, Abte roused Bayonne with a pinch on the nose. Huh? Bayonne asked, half asleep. What's the matter? What's the matter? Abte told him, bring your weapons. Now, both armed, Abte and Bayonne crept to the safe room barefoot. Abte recalled later that, quote, nothing disturbed the darkness or silence, unquote, as they neared the door to the chamber. They could neither hear nor see evidence of forced entry. For a moment, Abte questioned whether he had imagined the whole thing, the commotion outside, the lamplight in the safe room. But then he shook his head and whispered to Bayonne, I tell you I saw a light. Someone is trying to break into Josephine's safe. We must wake her up. The pair backtracked and slipped into the Châteaulin's bedchamber, shook her awake, and brought her up to speed. Rubbing her eyes, she leapt out of bed and looked out a window that afforded a view of the safe room. Abte most certainly had not hallucinated this light. She saw it too. Oh, look, she gasped. The three resolved to investigate. Baker grabbed a candelabra and led them, single file and in absolute silence. Outside the safe room, Abte took the doorknob in one hand, clutching a grenade in the other. Inhaling deeply, Abte threw open the door, ready to roll the explosive into the chamber if he saw so much as a hint of danger. Much to his relief, the hail of gunfire he half expected never came. The room was still, cloaked in darkness. The lamp that both he and Josephine had seen was nowhere in sight. Abte hit the lights, his eyes immediately locating the safe. By all appearances, it was untouched. Now confused as much as they were concerned, the trio searched every inch of the room, checking beneath the bed and even in the wardrobe. Not for the first time that night, Abte second-guessed himself, entertaining the possibility that he had witnessed a ghost. Then, as if to reassure him of his sanity, a lamp on a nightstand in one corner of the room flickered on by itself. One of the three investigators wiggled the cord that connected it with the wall, causing it to go out. The realization came over them almost as quickly as the light had gone out. This midnight scare was the result of nothing but finicky wiring. Baker giggled, and soon the two men were chuckling too. "You'll wake everyone up," she shushed them, a glint in her eye. "What about the noise that woke me?" Abte asked, suddenly more serious. He could swear on his mother's soul that he heard it. They hastened outside, scouring the garden for anything suspicious. Before long, they came upon a large flower pot, fallen to the ground and shattered to pieces. What or who could have broken it? An animal? Was this what had woken Abte? The disquieting truth was that they would never know, and as they trudged back inside and up to bed, they did so with a renewed sense of urgency. The sooner they could set out for Portugal, the better. Not long after the late-night disturbance, Baker and Abte finished getting ready for the Lisbon excursion, bidding farewell to Pelol. "You look good together," the spymaster opined while sizing them up. He put his arms around Abte and gave him a long embrace, before bending to kiss one of Baker's hands. "Bon voyage," he called to them as he turned to leave, struggling to suppress the emotion in his voice. There was a lot riding on this mission, and if it went south, Baker and Abte would die a cruel death at the hands of the Nazis. Quote, "She had undertaken of her own volition to cover me to the very end," Abte remarked, closing the door behind her and binding her fate to mine. "I call that courage," unquote. Later, the twosome boarded a train that would depart from Pau in the southwest of France, before chugging through the Pyrenees and across the border into Spain. To make it all the way to Portugal, the spies would first have to pass through Confranc, a mountain outpost in the extreme east of Spain. All trains stopped there, regardless of where their riders were destined, because Spain and France used railway gauges of differing sizes. Out of necessity, passengers disembarked and switched to a locomotive with the appropriate design before continuing onward to their final destination. Yet Confranc was also a closely watched checkpoint, manned by Spanish and French officials and monitored by undercover German operatives. Even a minor misstep could trigger a search of their belongings, with cataclysmic consequences for their mission. Discretion was paramount. When Baker and Abte's train reached Confranc, the megastar descended onto the platform, resplendent in her furs, dazzling in the bright Mediterranean sun. While a team of railroad employees unloaded her luggage, which contained sheet music inscribed with classified information, Baker smiled and waved at a crowd of starstruck train passengers and officials, not to mention one or two incognito German operatives. She breezed through security without a second glance from the guards, and nobody paid much attention to her manager, Monsieur Hébert, who shadowed his boss and kept his head down. At one point, Baker leaned over and whispered, "You see what a good cover I am?" Soon, she and Abte had settled into a cabin on an overnight express that would cut southward from Confranc toward the Spanish capital Madrid, some 300 miles away. Baker and Abte kept to themselves, napping every now and again, careful to avoid any unwanted attention. In Madrid, they made inquiries about the Rápido, the high-speed railway linking the Spanish and Portuguese capitals. To their dismay, tickets were sold out for the next few days. Looking for another way to Lisbon, they popped over to Iberia Airways, an airline with a direct flight to the Portuguese capital. As luck would have it, a couple of flyers had just canceled tickets for a plane that afternoon. The only catch was that takeoff was just 2 hours away. The secret agents weighed their options. There would be checks between here and Lisbon no matter how they made their journey, Apte reasoned. But it seemed probable that there would be fewer if they traveled by air as opposed to by rail. They bought the tickets, piled into a taxi, and booked it to the airport. It was not until the cab came to a stop at the airfield that Baker and Apte began to have second thoughts. They counted a dozen Nazi jets, instantly recognizable by the swastikas that adorned them. The Spanish airfield could just as easily have been a German base, Apte cracked later. Seemingly unfazed, Baker strutted into the nearby building for check-in with, quote, the casualness of a star among her girls, unquote. Yet she could only make it so far before 3 men in dark caps blocked her path. These guards were nowhere near as impressed as their confront counterparts. The two presented their passports and the Germans eyed them with care, repeatedly checking their names against an assortment of lists. The Nazis reviewed their travel documents over and over again, causing a fear to creep over Apte. Was their cover blown? Had they identified his passport as a fake? After what felt like an eternity, the Germans looked up, smiled, and waved them through. A short while later, they took a set of stairs into the plane, claimed their seats, and watched the propellers start to spin out the window. The aircraft, a DC-3, turned onto the runway, accelerating as its wheels left the ground. Almost as soon as they were airborne, however, a fighter jet flew alongside the fuselage. Baker regarded it with curiosity and concern. Was it a friend or a foe? Finally, the jet picked up speed and angled away from the larger aircraft, vanishing into the horizon. Apte heaved a sigh of relief, gazing down on a quote-unquote lunar landscape as the plane flew southwest. Within a few minutes, Baker had fallen asleep at his side, dead tired after several days of life-and-death subterfuge. Once they had safely landed in Lisbon, Baker and Apte split up, with the entertainer reserving a room at the ritzy Avis Hotel, while Apte unpacked a short walk away at the more budget option of the Hotel Avenida. Baker's sudden appearance in Lisbon did not go unnoticed by the press. A gaggle of reporters peppered her with questions in the Avis lobby. What had brought her to Lisbon? How long was she in town? I come to dance, to sing, she answered. I am stopping in Lisbon, but going to Rio, where I have further engagements. She might have liked to leave it at that, but the newspapermen would not let her go without a comment on the Nazis. Yes, I have sung for the soldiers at the front. Here she was referring to her turn in Paris, London. Yes, I saw many sad things. No, I have not returned to Paris since the defeat. No, I don't like the Germans, unquote. At first, Baker and Apte dreaded the sight of her picture splashed across Portuguese newspapers. It would only attract attention when what they most wanted was to keep a low profile. Yet soon they realized that the publicity reinforced their cover, broadcasting news of her Brazilian engagements. The next step in the plan was to establish contact with the British Embassy, that all-important portal to the British Secret Intelligence Services. Baker would lie low for this stage of the operation, while Apte delivered the intelligence. He certainly needed to watch his back. The streets and hostelries of Lisbon were crawling with Allied and Axis spies alike. In fact, intelligence men of the same nation tended to cluster in a preferred hotel. For instance, British operatives flocked to the Hotel Inglaterra, while Germans frequented the Hotel Atlantico. Still, spies from enemy territories inevitably bumped into each other, and even wound up at adjacent tables during breakfast. According to historian Neil Lockery, quote, it was a classic case of watching you, watching us, unquote. We have scant information about what happened when Apte handed over something like 40 documents to a Major Bacon at the British Embassy. That said, we do know it reached London quickly. 4 days after the handoff, when Apte was notified that a telegram had arrived for him at the British Embassy, he practically ran to pick it up. I went there alone, he recalled, for under no circumstances were Josephine's contacts with the British to be spotted by the Axis, unquote. London was delighted by the coup that Baker and Apte had executed. You are much loved in London, Major Bacon congratulated them. Tell your friends at the Ducium Bureau we are thrilled with your offer to establish an information pipeline between the SIS and the French. Baker and Apte had accomplished their mission. Upte and Baker had quite a few adventures together after the Lisbon job, and they also became lovers, as often happens when sexy spies risk their lives together. If you want to know more, check out Agent Josephine by Damian Lewis. After the Allies vanquished the Axis, Baker received the National Order of the Legion of Honor, the single most prestigious Order of Merit you could earn in France. The accompanying citation highlighted not only her cool-headed encounter with the Nazi colonel at Chateau de Milan, but also her daring mission to Portugal. It's a shame we don't know more about how Baker viewed her stint as a spy. Though she gave countless press interviews about her experiences ranging from her early childhood to her late career, and also published her memoirs, she tended to stay tight-lipped about her wartime heroics. Most of what we do have comes from the post-war writings of her handler, Jacques Opte, and a handful of other intelligence officials. What is clear, though, is that devotion to her adopted country is what motivated Baker to hazard life and limb. Those top-secret documents she carried across enemy lines were dispatched from Lisbon with love. Next episode, we're joined by author Michelle Young to talk about another female spy of World War II. Unlike Baker, this one stayed behind in Paris to spy on the Nazis. And that does it for the main portion of the episode. However, as I've mentioned before, this season is titled Spy vs. Spy for a reason. We are pitting all these spies against one another in competition. At the end of each episode, we are rating the spy in question based on whether they crushed it or came up short in the world of espionage. At the end of the season, we'll declare a winner. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll be joined by a very special guest to judge Josephine Baker. Stay tuned. It is my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Anne Foster. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited as people are when they're a guest judge on RuPaul's Drag Race.
If you've listened to this podcast for a while, you might recognize Anne Foster. That's because she actually appeared on the podcast back in season 3. She presented on a really colorful character named Princess Caribou. Go back and check out that episode if you haven't listened to it already. And Anne, I have to say, is the host of a fabulous podcast called Vulgar History. Anne, do you want to give us just a quick description of the podcast?
Sure. So Vulgar History is a feminist women's history comedy podcast. I think similar to your show, where I do so much research, but I present in a whimsical way. I'm making jokes as I go, but so you're learning stuff, but you're having a good time as well.
Yes, I listen to Vulgar History, and I can attest to the veracity and accuracy of that description. Super laid back, very funny, and extremely thoroughly researched. Well, before we get into the actual ranking process, let's just have a quick chat about Josephine Baker. Anne, I assume you were aware of Josephine Baker before you listened to these episodes. How much did you know about her?
I had never researched her, but I've come across just any fan of women's history or Black American history. I knew that she did spy stuff. I knew the banana skirt, but I didn't know how it all came together. I didn't know how she made that pivot from entertainer to spy. So it was an iconic story. For this spy versus spy, I'm going to be interested to see how anyone can beat her in any category, honestly.
I have to say, it's stiff competition right out the gate. Did you have a favorite part of the story?
I have a least favorite part of the story.
Oh my God, what's your least favorite part of the story?
Using semen as invisible ink.
In subsequent research, I've learned that they were actually experimenting with semen around the time of World War I as well. So it's something of a fixation among intelligence agents.
Well, if they're just what do we have an endless supply of in a time of rationing? We're all men.
That's right. We all got to do our part for the war effort, right? Let's go ahead and start the ranking process, shall we? So this is the first spy that we've judged, but I feel like this whole system will be pretty self-explanatory. We're going to assign points based on 5 separate categories. We'll do 1 to 10. So that means each spy can score a total of 50 points. Category number 1 is effectiveness. Anne, on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective was Baker as a spy? Did she succeed in accomplishing her mission? And how useful did her espionage prove in the end? So what do you think?
I mean, so in your episodes, you went into in-depth in that one mission, the Lisbon scenario. But like, I know that there's a whole book about her being a spy, right? Like, I'm sure she won the Medal of Honor afterwards. Like, clearly she was successful. She was never caught, right?
Yes.
The stuff that she was doing was very useful. I think this is a very high score. I don't know what we're setting a tone for all the spies, so I'm just like, how high do you want to go? But like, she was a good spy. On my podcast, I've covered some bad spies. I don't know if 10's too high, but at least
I think we should go for a 10. I think we should go for a 10 because I also know what's coming down the pipeline, and she is far more successful than other spies we will talk about this season.
Okay. Because I feel like everything the fact that she was never caught, that's the hallmark of a good spy.
Right. She evaded detection. She also was instrumental in setting up this pipeline between the French and the British. I would say 10 out of 10.
Oh, I just wanted to, I don't know if you're going to say the same thing I'm going to say, but just like, remember, she was a volunteer spy.
Yeah.
She was doing this out of the goodness of her heart and her patriotism. So just like, she was a good spy for free. She was volunteer spying.
Yep. They're like, isn't it funny how the Ducian Bureau is like, we do not have the money to pay you, but would you still like to lay down your life, potentially?
Honestly, I was just like, would I have done that? Probably not. But it's so iconic that it was just like, hey, do you want to be a volunteer spy? Yes. Like,
yes, please. Like, sign me
impressive, cool people. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that's fair. Okay. So we're looking at a 10 out of 10 on effectiveness. Okay. Next category, courage. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much bravery did Josephine Baker show in the face of danger?
So we're talking just about her spy career, not her life
and this
in general.
And this is important. I should have said this at the beginning. We're just rating her as a spy, not as a human being.
Okay, because
artist.
she did have a pet cheetah. So I think her courage in general was higher than the average person.
That's true. She also placed a lot of people in danger by taking the cheetah around with her.
To the opera.
Yes.
I think her courage I think this is also an incredibly high score. I think, like, everything you described in the episode that everyone just listened to, but like the whole mission to Lisbon, like the fact that she went there, did that, like every time she was questioned, like she was able to pull it all off. Like if she didn't have the courage, she wouldn't have been successful, right? I think she was incredibly courageous.
One of my favorite moments in both episodes is when the Nazi soldier just rolls up into the Chateau de Milan and interrogates her. And he's been told that she is stockpiling weapons there in the basement. So, and that was part of her work for the French resistance. So if anyone found out, I mean, she would have been facing serious consequences, potentially execution. So I would definitely say very courageous.
I feel like a 10. I don't know.
I think it's 10 out of 10. Next category, seductiveness. Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did Baker harness her seductiveness to work as a spy? And here, we aren't necessarily talking about sex appeal only. We're also thinking of things like magnetism, charm, star power, charisma.
I think that it is a shame that there's not a James Bond-like movie series about Josephine Baker just like seducing people, both sexually and also just with her charm, because I feel she's like the Lady James Bond. This is another huge score. Like, first of all, like she did become lovers with that guy who she went to Lisbon with. But I think she's able to use her magnetism, like you talk about when she gets to Lisbon, like wrapped in her furs, just being like, it's me, Josephine Baker. Like she's able to use this charisma, of which she has more than the average person.
Yes.
And she's able to sort of like stun people. What number are you thinking?
Okay, so for me, and I'm saying this partly because we've already given her 2 perfect 10s, and I want to say that she definitely was seductive. It was important for her, but I don't know if it was like the most important attribute of her of her espionage.
I agree.
So I don't think we're looking at a 10 out of 10, but maybe we're looking at like a little higher than 5 because it was, it played a role. So I don't know. How are you feeling about like a 6 or a 7?
I'm thinking 7 maybe. And I like the way that you just explained that, where it's like she was a really successful spy because of her courage, her intelligence. Like she was able to be like, see a situation and like make a pivot in the last minute, like when switching from the airplane or whatever. Like I think that those are her best skills, and she had all this charisma, but the charisma wasn't that wasn't why she was successful, but it was there too, strongly.
Okay.
Yeah.
She earned a 7. There's nothing to be ashamed of, Josephine, because you're doing very well so far. Category 4 out of 5. This is cunning. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how cleverly deceptive was Baker as a spy?
Man, okay. So again, like you don't go into everything she ever did in your podcast, but from what I listened to, even the fact that she was like, okay, we need to get to Portugal. Like we can't get those passports. Well, what if I say that I'm going to do a tour in Brazil? Like, and we'll have to pass through Portugal. It's just like, that's cunning. That's smart.
It's a kind of like bureaucratic administrative savvy that you don't necessarily associate with like, I don't know, a super spy, right?
Yeah. Or even with like with an entertainer. Like, but the fact that she's like, okay,
Right.
well, where do I need to go so we can pass through Portugal, Brazil? And then the fact that she's like, okay, I'll just do a tour.
Right. It's just like, oh, I'm best friends with the ambassador. This is no big deal, right?
At least a 7 for sure.
I'm just so impressed by the entire fake, like, musical tour element of the espionage that I feel like I want to give her, let's go with an 8. And finally, we come to the last category. This is artistry. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did Baker draw on her skills as an artist or on her general involvement in the art world in her work as a spy?
This is interesting. Can I ask you a question first?
Yes.
So the other spies, because you are art of crime, so do all the spies have an art element to them that you're going to be
They
doing?
have some kind of artistic connection, yes.
Okay, because she has such a strong artistic connection, like the invisible ink, like going on tour, like using her tours as a cover for spy stuff. Like,
I mean, even sheet music. I mean, the invisible ink on the sheet music for her tour. I mean, yeah.
Like the artistry is sort of like a crucial part of her success. And like I don't know. I mean, I'll hear the other episodes when you do them, but like, I can't imagine a spy who's artist, unless someone that you're going to cover is like a painter and there's like secret messages like inside the canvas or something. Like she used her artistry, unless the only thing I could think that she could have done that she didn't do, and she didn't need to, obviously, is if her show had secret coded messages in it. If she was like, if I do this song, followed by this song, followed by this song, that means they're on to us. So she's using not so much the artistry part, but like the sort of like behind the scenes, stage managerial business of her art career. So I would say maybe like a 7-8.
Let's go for an 8. So that gives us 43 out of 50. That's a pretty strong score,
That's incredibly strong.
I think Josephine Baker is definitely one to beat.
If you're doing that by percentages, that's 86%.
86%. Yeah,
I feel like
it's not bad.
That's an A. Not A+, but like when you're a spy, the fact like any spy who survived, that's an A. Because she was
yes.
caught.
If you have lived to tell the tale, then you already get an A. Mm-hmm. Well, that does it. That's spy number 1. And thank you so much for listening to the episode and taking the time to judge Josephine Baker. I think fairly. Tough, but fair.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Once again, a big thank you to Ann Foster of Vulgar History Podcast. Go ahead and give it a listen if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. You've been listening to The Art of Crime, created, written, and narrated by yours truly, Gavin Whitehead. Liam Bellman Sharp edited sound and composed the score. Last but not least, 1,000 thanks to research and production assistant Ken Symphonies. If you like what you heard on The Art of Crime, please tell the world, by which I mean everyone you know, plus the occasional stranger. Also, if you can, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. It goes a long way in helping others find out about the show. Finally, all throughout history, artists have relied on the support of patrons to make their work. The same holds true for podcasters making shows about historical artists, so please consider making a donation at www.patreon.com/artofcrimepodcast. Every bit counts and is massively appreciated. As a reminder, be sure to check out the Art of Crime website at www.artofcrimepodcast.com. It features all kinds of images relevant to the show, including maps, drawings, paintings, photographs, sheet music, and more. You can also follow us on Facebook at Art of Crime Podcast, Instagram at Art of Crime Podcast, and Twitter at Art of Crime Pod. If you have questions, comments, or feedback, please don't hesitate to drop me a line at artofcrimepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time.